They were making love in Dan's bedroom. Alice was reaching her peak, dragging her nails over Dan's back hard enough to leave thin red tracks. She cried out and arched her back as Dan's movements became more intense. He breathed Alice's name into her ear before he too cried out. They clutched one another desperately, kissing as if it were their last moment together.
Oh, Dan, that was fantastic. I'm gonna take a shower.
At first, when she and Dan started dating last year, Alice had thought with resignation that it would only be temporary until someone prettier and more interesting came along and captured Dan's attention. But as their relationship went on, Alice found that she was becoming prettier and more interesting. Last year, after the deaths of her brother and friends, Alice thought that nothing good would ever happen to her again. But that had changed. Not only was she ecstatically happy with Dan, her father had stopped drinking and started going to Alcoholics Anonymous. With graduation less than 12 hours away, Alice was happy. She turned on the shower, waited for the water to get hot, then stepped into the billowing steam and began to soap up, lifting her face to the jets of hot water. She scrubbed her hair, working up a lather, as a gurgling sound cut through the hiss of the shower. Alice stopped, frowned, and listened. The sound was coming from below. She looked down to see the water in the tub swirling frantically over the drain, being sucked loudly through the tiny round holes. She stepped back from the drain, frowning. The drain was sucking the water into an unnaturally violent whirlpool. The pull was so strong that Alice could feel her feet slipping over the bottom of the tub toward the drain, slipping, until her legs flew out from under her and she landed on her ass, sliding down the tub toward the drain, fighting the tremendous pull, her arms flailing as she was sucked down into an oppressive blackness through which she plummeted helplessly until she landed in a naked heap on a cold floor. She huddled into a crouched position, hugging herself to hide her nakedness in the dim light as she listened to the sound of loud, babbling voices. She turned slowly, fearfully, and looked down a long, narrow room with plain metal-framed beds lined against the walls on either side. There were mattresses on the floor, some of them ripped to shreds. There were men moving in the shadows, some on the beds, others walked or crawling on the cold, dirty floor. They wore what appeared to be pajamas that had once been white. Now they were darkened by brown and yellow stains. Grimy lumps clung to the material. The men looked filthy, their hair scraggly and shiny with grease. Some of them masturbated in dark corners, grunting wetly as their eyes rolled in their heads. Others laughed as they picked at their clothes and clawed at their faces again and again. Some of the men paced frantically, murmuring to themselves as if their lives were about to end. None of them noticed her. Not yet, anyway, she thought with a sudden jolt of fear. A sound made her turn around to face a steep metal staircase that led to a thick lead door. Two men with name tags on their white institutional uniforms stood in the doorway, backlit by a glaring white light.
How many do you think they are? I'd make it an even 100.
Alice took a breath to shout at them for help, but she realized suddenly she was fully clothed. She stood slowly and looked down at herself. She was wearing a nurse's uniform with a name tag over her left breast. It read, Amanda Kruger.
Merry Christmas, lunatics!
No, wait!
She was startled by the sudden silence behind her and turned to see the men facing her. Some of them smiled, others laughed, and a few just grunted, drooling as they reached out for her, staggering forward. Terrified, Alice stumbled backward and turned, but there were more of them. They came from every direction.
Me first. I'm first. Let me through.
A thin, hunched man pushed his way through the crowd, cackling as he grinned at her with wet lips. Alice dropped to her knees, fist clenched, screaming because the man pressing toward her looked so familiar. His skin was smooth, and yet hair. He had not been burned, but his eyes, his nose, his mouth, even his voice. She had seen him before. The wiry man slobbered as he reached out, grabbed her hair, and as she screamed, opening her eyes and looking down to see Dan, she lay on top of him, and he stared up at her, shocked. Alice gave a sigh, relieved that her nightmare was over. She reached out to stroke Dan's cheek. He smiled, but his smile became a sinister grin, and he moved quickly, violently, rolling Alice onto her back, and she cried out, startled, looking up as the slobbering man grinned down at her, clutching her shoulders as he worked his way between her legs.
You love it, Alice, don't you? Alice?
Alice! Alice! Wake up! Wake up! It's okay, sweetheart. It's only me.
Oh, I guess I was having a nightmare.
Well, everything's gonna be okay now.
Dusk began to fall as Alice walked to work. She was hurrying along the sidewalk, not wanting to be late, when she heard a sound. A sing-song sound like children chanting softly. She slowed her pace as she began to pass through Springwood Park to go into town, and looked through the fence to the children playing in the park. They were jumping rope, sitting in the mounds of sand between the swing set and the monkey bars. Very familiar children. Their skin was ghostly white, their eyes dark and stomachs bloated, and they were chanting. As they counted on and on, Alice stopped and watched them, thinking to herself, this should not be happening. She hurried by them, trying desperately to ignore them in their ominous chanting, heading toward the open green in the middle of the park, when she noticed that the children had added something new to the rhyme. She spun toward them, but they were gone. Turning back again to head for work, she saw that where there had been nothing a moment ago, there now stood an imposing Gothic-style building with stone walls and towers. She somehow knew, although she had no idea how she knew, that it was a Catholic hospital, a sort of convent. Nuns in sparkling white habits walked in and out of doorways and scurried across the green grass surrounding the sinister building.
I'm awake. I'm not dreaming. Why is this happening?
Unable to resist her curiosity, she moved toward the building and walked through the enormous entrance into a dark, musty corridor, past an empty nurse's station, past endless open doors that led into utter darkness. And there was a smell, sweet and sickly and disturbing. As she rounded a corner, Alice caught a glimpse of a white gown disappearing through a doorway with a quiet rustle. Alice hurried after the nun, hoping for an explanation. Hurrying into the room, Alice saw a metal spiral staircase going up into the misty darkness. Looking around, she could not see the nun, so she started up the staircase. The step beneath her foot gave way. Alice plummeted down into the darkness. She landed on her back on a moving gurney. The ceiling passed her rapidly, and she jerked as the gurney was pushed through double doors with a bang. Nurses in white habits and doctors in surgical wear surrounded the gurney as it was rushed down a corridor. Confused, Alice looked down at herself and saw that her belly was horribly distended beneath the sheet, almost as if she were pregnant. She looked at one of the doctors in his green surgical mask.
You're going to be all right. Just do exactly as I say.
Alice sat up on the gurney and screamed.
No! This isn't happening!
She froze. The gurney had stopped in the delivery room, and she was staring at a crowd of observers. Nurses, doctors, nuns, priests. and herself. The air around her had become thick. It seemed to shift, and in the blink of an eye she was standing in the group of observers looking at the gurney where a young woman lay, her face glistening with perspiration, her eyes wide with pain and confusion. The woman, her dark brown hair clinging to her sweaty forehead, looked directly at Amanda and hissed.
We must put an end to this evil. You and me, we must.
Her body stiffened, and she cried out in pain as she writhed in the clutches of a contraction.
Work with me. Come on now, here it comes. Just breathe. Now push!
The woman jutted her pelvis as the doctor and a white-habited nurse leaned between her legs, and she opened her mouth as if to yawn, cried out in pain, and the doctor groaned.
What is that?
The nurse bundled something in a cloth and held it to her breast, murmuring,
One of God's creatures.
The woman on the gurney sat up and said breathlessly,
God had nothing to do with that.
The nurse looked at her, shocked, her face turning almost as white as her habit.
That child, that thing was conceived in pure evil.
The nurse backed away from her, looking down at the baby. Its tiny arms jutted from the cloth and small hands clutched the nurse's throat, making her stumble back against the wall. She slid to the floor. The child, the thing, shot from beneath the blanket and scurried across the floor like a giant insect, making a horrible braying sound. The doctors and other nurses staggered backward, gasping at what they saw. Alice cried out as the small creature headed toward her, a blur of glistening gray and pink streaking across the floor. Alice dove out of the way as the creature shot through the delivery room doors. Quickly getting to her feet, Alice turned to see that the delivery room was empty. Frightened, but determined, Alice moved forward toward the swinging double doors of the delivery room and pushed through to see that she was no longer in a hospital. Her surroundings had changed, for the worst. Alice now stood in a church, not just any church. It was the church in which she had last seen Freddy, the church in which she thought she had defeated him and freed his young, helpless victims. Alice moved up the center aisle with caution. She paused. Up ahead, in a dusty heap on the floor at the foot of the pulpit, Alice spotted Freddy's remains. The tattered red and green striped sweater, the wrinkled hat and pants, the rusted claw that glimmered dully in a dusty shaft of stained-glass light. As Alice pressed on, muttering deliberately,
This is over, damn it. I swear this is over.
Something moved from behind the pulpit. Something small, vaguely human, with gleaming, flayed skin. It ran its small tongue around its frayed lips as it moved toward Freddy's remains, and as it neared the small pile, it grew more and more human, taking on the all-too-familiar features of the man, the thing that had once worn those clothes, that claw. Seeing the sense of dark purpose in the creature's eyes, Alice screamed.
No, God damn it, no!
She lunged towards the altar as the creature scurried into Freddy's filthy pants, slobbering as it disappeared beneath the material. Alice ran up the aisle toward the altar, halted suddenly. The floor beneath the altar was splintering, breaking apart, rising up to suddenly form a sort of wooden hill that threw Alice backward and off her feet. She crawled desperately up the growing incline, determined to stop what she was certain was about to happen, what she was certain she was powerless to prevent, all the while thinking,
This can't be happening. I can't be dreaming. I'm not asleep.
Alice clawed at the lifting floor, trying to pull herself up the incline, keeping her eyes on Freddy's clothes as they filled out as if being inflated, and suddenly floor had fallen back into place. She lay still for a long moment. She could feel the impact through her entire body. As she lifted her head, her eyes fell on Freddy's clawed glove lying beside the altar. A horribly burned hand reached out from behind the pulpit and snatched the glove. Alice stiffened, scrambled to her feet, and stared up at the altar. Beams of light filtered through the shifting dust as a vague figure appeared from behind the pulpit. As the dust cleared, she saw him, Freddy, staring down at himself, inspecting his body. Then he smiled at her.
It's a boy.
Kruger, you son of a bitch! You're dead!
That never stopped me before.
I closed the door on you!
Somebody must have left the key in the lock.
Alice ran up the center aisle after him, but Freddy was gone. The only movement on the altar was dust.
There's no such thing as safe sex.
He lifted his razor-fingered hand. The doors of the church swung open, and a long rectangle of light fell down the center aisle over them. Freddy spun around, and Alice looked at the door to see the woman who had given birth to the child thing. She wore a bloody hospital gown and looked horribly pale. She pointed a finger at Freddy accusingly, and when she spoke, her voice sounded old, so old.
You were conceived in fear and hatred, born in guilt and pain.
She changed before Alice's eyes. She became old, her skin wrinkling, sagging, and the hospital gown she wore became a white nun's habit.
I can never forgive you for what you have done.
Alice realized that Freddy was backing away slowly, and she saw in his face, for the first time ever, utter horror. That horror quickly decayed into a burning rage. He spun around, and in a few quick steps disappeared. Turning to the door again, Alice saw the nun walking away. The doors swung closed slowly.
Wait! Please don't go!
Alice called, hurrying after her, throwing the doors open, to see the Crave Inn. The diner was completely empty, except for Anne, who tossed an angry glare at Alice from behind the register. Alice looked down at herself to see that she was wearing the clothes she had put on for work.
Why is it so empty?
You're over 4 hours late is why. What happened to you?
4 hours?
Hello?
Dan? It's happening again.
What is?
I was sure he was dead, but he's back now.
Alice, slow down. Are you sure it's Freddy? Maybe you're just having nightmares.
No, Dan, this is real. Please come over here now. I need you.
Of course. I'll be right there. I love you.
I love you too.
Dan ran to his motorcycle. He sped away from the university and headed for the Crave Inn. The bike shot down the road. Suddenly, it accelerated to a frightening speed. The front wheel was thrown upward into a wheelie. He struggled to keep the motorcycle balanced. Dan clutched the brakes with no results. The bike moved faster and faster through the night, and the lights of the houses along the road became a creamy blur as the bike's frame began to vibrate dangerously beneath him. He dodged oncoming headlights that shot past him like missiles. When he looked down at the gauges, he saw each one was trembling at its maximum capacity. When it seemed the motorcycle could go no faster, it increased its speed even more. Dan felt his face distort as if it were melting beneath the G-forces, felt his eyes sting. Suddenly, the gauges began to spark, and their glass faces cracked. Dan struggled to look down as the gauges sizzled and melted into a glistening mound of liquid metal and plastic, undulating wetly, beginning to slowly change shape, almost as if it were taking on facial features, almost, but not quite, human features.
Kruger!
face grinned up at him from the space occupied moments ago by the bike's gauges. The brake levers on the handlebars split. They became 4 long, shiny blades, which clamped down over Dan's hands, pressing harder and harder until they cut into the flesh between his knuckles. Rib-like ridges rose up from the glossy black gas tank, creating a sort of torso beneath the grinning face. The torso began to expand and contract with deep breaths. The ribs extended downward on each side of the bike, forming organic breathing pipes that disappeared into the bike's engine. Each pipe began to bulge and throb as if something were pressing to get out. New exhaust pipes appeared. They began to grow deep, burning red as they grew hotter and hotter until they wrapped around Dan's bare legs, blackening his skin with a crackling sizzle. The claws on the handlebars reached up suddenly, grabbed Dan's shoulders, and jerked him down until his tortured face was inches from Freddy's.
Better buckle up!
He pushed him upright again.
Ah!
As the claws raked down his bare arms, cutting red trails through the flesh, the pipes burned into his legs, cooking their way through muscle tissue.
Freddy says, don't dream and drive.
He saw the headlights of his own truck rushing head-on toward the motorcycle.
Alice!
Alice slapped a juicy pink hamburger patty onto the grill and pressed it down with the spatula as the radio played tinny rock and roll. The meat sizzled. She picked up the coffee pot to pour a cup of coffee for a single late-night customer, when suddenly the room seemed to melt around her, and the sounds, the sizzling burger and the radio decayed into warbling gurgles, and Alice dropped the coffee pot to the floor as the wall ahead of her melted away like hot wax. She was looking down a long, deserted road beneath a starry sky. Far up ahead, headlights appeared like pinpricks of light. They grew larger and larger and larger still as she recognized Dan's truck and began to hear his voice.
Alice!
No! No! Please, God! No!
Feeling sick with dread, she dashed through the door and ran into the street, looking in the direction from which she knew Dan would come. Alice clawed her face. Several hundred yards down the street, a jackknife semi was curled around a flaming wad of crumbled metal. Panicking, Alice ran toward the accident. As she rounded the truck, a man lurched from around the corner, his face badly cut and bleeding. He grabbed Alice's shoulder and shook her.
It wasn't my fault. He came out of nowhere. Nowhere, I tell you. Like he was going 1,000 miles an hour. Like I never seen anything like it. Like he was on a fucking rocket to hell.
Alice tore herself away from the hysterical truck driver and turned to see Dan. She staggered backward, belching fire as bile rose from her gut. His face was gone, so was part of his head. He was pinned in the mass of charred metal, and the fire was toying with his skin. Alice spun away from it as the night filled with flashing red and blue lights. She dropped to her knees, and then the pavement began to fly up toward her face. Alice passed out. Alice opened her eyes to see Yvonne sitting beside her bed, wearing her white uniform and name tag. It took a moment for realization to wash over Alice, but when it did, when she remembered the horrible vision she had had and the carnage she had seen in the street outside the Crave Inn, she sat bolt upright.
Where am I?
Everything's okay. You're in the hospital, under observation.
My God. He used to do it when I was asleep, and only then. But something's changed that.
Hey, slow down. You're not making sense.
How did Dan die?
He died in an accident with a semi.
That was no accident. That was Freddy.
Please try to rest. Dr. Morris, is there something we could give Alice to help her relax?
I'm afraid there'll be no sedatives for this young lady for a while. These outbursts are totally understandable after traumatic shock, and especially for a young lady in your condition.
What condition? What's wrong?
Oh, absolutely nothing that 9 months of taking care of yourself won't cure. You're pregnant.
The next morning, Yvonne drove Alice from the hospital. They stopped at the Crave Inn where Greta and Mark were waiting. As they listened, Alice told them of her terrifying experience.
Look, Alice, you can't expect us to believe that a guy out of your dreams killed Dan. It was an accident.
Mark, this isn't something new. Didn't Dan ever tell you what happened to my brother and my friends?
Dan would never talk about that.
Look, you guys, I'm not making this up. He gets in through me, through my dreams. I bring people to him.
I don't know, Alice. This whole thing is pretty tough to swallow.
Sooner or later, you guys will believe me. I only hope that by the time you do, it's not too late.
The day of Dan's funeral, Greta Gibson was miserable. In fact, miserable was too tame a word. Her mother, who insisted that she call her by her first name, Racine, was throwing one of her famous dinner parties. Greta was seated at the opposite end of the table from Racine, hoping to avoid being noticed by any of her mother's trendy friends. The man at the end of the table, his name was Lorne, and he was a sort of new age past life therapist, smiled at Greta.
You're not eating, Greta. Are you a vegetarian?
My daughter's more of a nothing-tarian. You know, Greta dear, you could at least try the monkfish. It is imported after all.
Greta resisted, rolling her eyes in disgust. Racine was always harping on her to keep her figure, for the camera, she'd say. But at the same time, she was always harping on her to eat. It made no sense, but Racine never made any sense. The only thing she was interested in was trendy gossip about trendy people. Greta felt a surge of anger and let her fork clatter onto her plate.
We buried one of my best friends today, Mother.
There was a moment of uncomfortable silence at the table. But then they were off again, having another trendy conversation about another trendy subject. Greta stared at her plate, feeling tired. She hadn't slept well since Dan's death. How could she? The way Alice was carrying on. But she suddenly felt unbearably tired. She closed her eyes, just for a moment, tuning out the droning voices around her, trying not to think about where she was. She jerked her head up suddenly with a start. Racine's face was inches from Greta's. She was standing beside her, leaning forward with a stern look on her face.
You've got to at least try the fish. Our guests will think there's something wrong with it.
Yes, Greta, come on. Have a little. Good, see? Here comes the airplane.
Would you like me to have the caterer bring you something else? Oh, Frederick!
The name sent a chill down Greta's spine. She looked down at the table, taking in a deep breath as her mother took her plate away. Another hand replaced it with a new one. A horribly scarred hand wearing a glove that had knives attached to the fingers. Greta sucked in breath sharply and looked up. But the kitchen door was already swinging closed and the caterer was gone. She looked down at the plate again. It was covered with 4 piles of different kinds of mush, like baby food.
With a waiter gonna clean her plate for Mommy like a good girl?
Racine scooped some of the mush into a spoon, lifting it to Greta's mouth. Disgusted, Greta turned her head away and tried to lift a hand to push the spoon from her mouth, but she couldn't move either of her arms. She looked down and saw that she was sitting in a filthy, rusted old high chair, and her arms were held down beneath the dirty tray that covered her lap. Greta froze for a moment, thinking, wait a minute, wait just a minute.
Come on, a big bite from Mommy.
Racine was pressing the spoon of goop to Greta's lips. With little choice in the matter, Greta opened her mouth and took in the slop. Some of it spattered on her chin.
There's Mommy's good girl.
Racine scooping up another spoonful of the stuff. She shoved it hard into Greta's mouth before Greta could resist and scooped up another. She pushed spoonful after spoonful into Greta's mouth. pressing the spoon into the roof of her mouth before slipping it out and dribbling the goop on her chin. Bits of it clung to Greta's face as she struggled in the high chair, trying to cry out but unable to make any more than a gargling sound. Glops of the slimy substance slapped onto Greta's dress and splashed on her arms. She thought she could almost feel it caking on her, growing dry and crusty. All the while, the trendies seated around the table smiled and nodded. Greta jerked her head back and forth and finally spat out a mouthful of the goop. Clenching her eyes shut and trying to speak to protest, she opened her eyes. The man grinned as he raised his razor-clawed hand towards her face so she could see what he held delicately between his thumb and forefinger. It was a tiny, miniature version of herself, squirming and crying out in agony and fear.
You are what you eat.
Using his other hand to force her mouth open, Greta tried to scream, tried to call for her mother, even for Alice, but nothing came from her mouth except little globules of the mush her mother had been feeding her. She struggled, trying to fight his iron grip, but it was useless. He pried her mouth open, held the tiny creature. Me, she thought frantically. That's me. He plopped it under her tongue, then pressed her jaw up until her teeth clacked together. She felt the miniature version of herself squirming in her clamped mouth and tried to lower her jaw again, but Freddy's grip was too strong. The thing in her mouth crawled backward, down her tongue, squirming, wriggling, until it slid down her throat. Then it stopped. She tried to take a breath, but could not. She tried to exhale, but could not. It was lodging in her throat, writhing, kicking, and scratching. Baby food wasn't bad. It wasn't bad at all. Alice opened a third jar, and as she twisted the jar's lid, it made a muffled burping sound, and yellow vomitous mush slapped onto the wall before her. She stared at it as it oozed down the wall slowly. Then she realized the baby food was not dribbling toward the floor, but moving with purpose over the wall, taking shape, forming a set of long vertical lips like a mouth. Except it wasn't a mouth because the lips split, forming several flowery, delicate folds that opened. Greta's head and shoulders oozed from between them, and she screamed.
Alice, help me!
She reached out a hand as the lips began to close around her, sucking her back. Alice lunged forward and grabbed Greta's arms, pulling with all her might. But they were slippery, and she quickly lost her grip. Instead, she reached forward and wrapped her fingers around the fleshy lips and tried to pry them apart, pulling harder and harder, until finally they gave and opened up. But before Alice could grab hold of her, Greta fell away from her, screaming as she disappeared down the long, membranous tunnel in which she had seen Dan fall only days ago. Holding the enormous lips open, Alice screamed. The lips slapped shut and disappeared. Alice stood in the kitchen a moment, then spun around and grabbed the telephone receiver and began punching Greta's number. But before she was finished, her insides were seized by a sharp pain that tightened its grip until she dropped the receiver and lurched forward, leaning against the wall. She fell to her knees. She cried out. It was gone. She leaned back against the cupboard.
Dear God, what's happening?
When Yvonne's shift ended early the next morning, she went straight to the university locker room and changed from her uniform into a bikini. It had been a rough night, and she was looking forward to a long rest in the steam room, then a few laps around the pool. In the steam room, she sat with her back to the wall, hugging one leg to her breasts. She needed some time alone. away from work and even her friends. She'd been so busy lately. She'd had no time just to relax and think a while. About Dan, about Greta. The hot steam wrapped her in a blanket of clinging warmth, massaging her stiff muscles, loosening them, relieving their aches. She leaned her head back, closed her eyes, and sat up with a gasp, drenched with perspiration. Damn, she said, chiding herself for falling asleep. She couldn't afford to spend the whole morning in the steam room. Yvonne stood and left the steam room, went to the pool, climbed up to the diving board. Still feeling groggy, she stopped to rub her eyes before walking out onto the board. The diving board lurched suddenly, nearly knocking her over the side to the concrete 30 feet below. She clutched the railing and screamed as the board began to shake violently, and the metal girders that supported it groaned loudly as if under a tremendous strain. Yvonne leaned against the railing, hugging it desperately, and looked over the side as the girders beneath her began to wilt slowly as if they were melting. They swayed this way, that way. They began to move faster, whipping the board back and forth. She clutched the railing even harder until it snapped off in her arms like a frail piece of plastic. Yvonne pressed herself flat against the board, face down, hugging it for life, when the board itself began to break up. It separated into 4 long, narrow sections that spread apart slowly, farther and farther apart like 4 enormous fingers.
No! This can't be happening!
Giant, curved knives sprang from the ends of the 4 sections as they curled slowly around her. Yvonne looked over her shoulder as one of the girders shot upward from the back of the board and bent as if jointed like a thumb.
No! Please, God, no! Somebody help me! Please, somebody help me!
She clutched the lip that surrounded the pool and began pulling with all her strength to lift herself out of the mire when 2 feet appeared before her.
Careful! There's an undertow!
No! Please help me! Help me!
She sat up in the steam room with a little cry, froze, and looked around her when she realized she'd fallen asleep and dreamed it. She relaxed a little, but only for a moment. A chill crept over her.
Oh my God. It's true. Everything that Alice said is true.
From the tone of your voice, Yvonne, I expected some sort of emergency. But I don't see anything about Alice that would make ultrasound necessary this early in the pregnancy. And it certainly isn't necessary on a Sunday afternoon.
After my experience yesterday, Doctor, I considered this an emergency.
Oh, don't tell me you're seeing the boogeyman too, Yvonne.
Doctor, I just want to make sure my baby's all right.
Alice, I can assure you that
Do unborn babies dream, Dr. Morris?
approximately 78% of their day. There's even been some research supporting the concept of a dream link between child and mother, a sort of psychic umbilical cord.
I'm not sure that I understand you correctly, Doctor.
Well, it seems that there may be times when a mother is actually able to experience her unborn baby's dreams.
Mark was in his room at home. He was drawing a single picture over and over again, each time from a different angle. A house he had seen in a dream, with the rusty, spiked welcome mat before the door. He began to nod sleepily over his work, and sat up with a jerk, yawning, then sipping his coffee. As he set his cup down again, he noticed a comic book on his table that he hadn't seen before. He picked it up and read the title written in red, dripping letters on the cover, Kruger's Nightmares from Hell. Curious, he opened it at random and gasped when he saw a drawing of Greta in an enormous high chair, her white, bloated face covered with dribbling lumps of food. Horrified, Mark flipped through the comic book and saw a drawing of Dan in the clutches of a motorcycle with hideous human features, and Yvonne diving into an empty swimming pool with an enormous vaginal-like opening in at the bottom, and himself. The drawing depicted Mark at his drawing table reading the comic book. It was followed by several blank panels. He took a breath.
Oh my God!
A terribly scarred hand tore out of the comic book pages and slapped onto Mark's face. The fingers digging into his flesh, and as Mark screamed, the hand pulled with tremendous strength, ripping Mark from his chair and into the comic book. Lying on her back, Alice watched the ultrasound machine and chanted as she listened to the sound of her baby's heartbeat. Mark ran to the nearest window, but it would not open.
Faster than a head-on collision.
As Mark clawed at the window, searching for a hold, he saw movement outside, a comic book version of a semi, and Dan's red truck were headed straight for one another at high speed. When they collided, the word crash appeared in a jagged bubble in the air above them.
What the? No!
Deader than your darling Greta.
When Mark lowered his hands, the window was gone, replaced by a vivid drawing of Greta in an old, decayed high chair, her skin rotting, her eyes gone from their sockets, her mouth hanging open and filled with mush.
Able to shred stupid little boys into bits and pieces.
Alice lay on the bed and stared at the ceiling, wondering if perhaps the ultrasound would not detect any damage Freddy might cause. When the ceiling disappeared, as she heard Mark screaming, and she saw a frightened comic book illustration of him in his room, his eyes wide with horror. As Freddy brought his claws down and sliced through the drawing of Mark, they cut him as if he were paper. He was paper, and the shreds fluttered to the floor in a pool of bright red ink. Alice bolted upright, swinging her legs off the bed, as the wall before her began to pulsate, ribbed with veins, and the vertical lips appeared once again, opening to reveal the long pink tunnel that glistened with dribbling juices. And without warning, Alice was sucked off the bed and pulled headlong into the opening. She tumbled head over heels down the twisting tunnel until she was swept into an enormous, cavernous opening with viscous walls lined with pulsing veins. She lost some speed and moved slower as she tumbled between arteries and organs. She recognized them immediately. They looked like the illustrations from her biology textbooks, but she didn't understand them. Human organs hung over her like giant stars in a night sky. Alice floated slowly into a beam of glowing light and turned around to see a giant fetus. Its knees curled up beneath its chin. Her eyes widened as she thought,
My baby! I'm inside myself.
The uterine wall behind the fetus began to bulge, and undulate facial features began to protrude from the glistening pink surface until Freddy was grinning at her.
Like father, like son.
No! You're not my baby's father!
Of course I'm not.
Dr. Morris, my baby! What did he do to my baby?
There's absolutely nothing wrong with your baby. He's a perfectly healthy child. A little big for so early on, but as active as any normal baby I've ever seen.
He's feeding the souls to my baby. I saw it, all of it, and he got Mark. I saw his soul.
I'm sorry, Doctor. She's been having such a tough time since Dan died. I thought this might help. I'm really sorry we dragged you down here. Come on, honey. I'll take you home.
No, I have to go to the library.
Alice sat in the Springwood Public Library, watching as microfilm newspaper articles passed before her on the screen, chronicling the lives and deaths of Fred Krueger's victims. She wasn't sure exactly what she was looking for, but she was certain she'd know when it came. It finally did. Killer Krueger's mother dies mysteriously. Alice froze on a photograph of a nun in a white habit, the same nun she had seen in her waking dream the evening Dan died, and the caption below read, Amanda Krueger, was it suicide? She focused on the woman in the picture, placed both hands flat on the table before her, and began to concentrate hard, her forehead breaking out with beads of perspiration as she stared at Amanda Kruger intensely until the air was sucked away from around her and she shot backwards, passing through some invisible hole in reality. She was standing before the same gothic stone building she'd seen in Springwood Park in her waking dream days before, the building in which Alice had watched Freddy Krueger's birth. There was no one around, so Alice entered. She hurried down a long, cold corridor, determined to find the woman who had spoken to her, the woman who had frightened Freddy Krueger. She stopped in the corridor and spun around to see a small boy standing a few yards behind her beneath a stone archway. He was not facing her and did not turn when she spoke. He was looking up at someone else, someone standing out of sight behind the edge of the archway. He turned and staggered suddenly. Alice shouted as she rushed towards him. It was suddenly no longer important that she find Amanda Krueger. Nothing seemed as important as helping the pale little boy. He fell into her arms when she reached him, looking into her eyes wearily. He was perspiring, feverish. He no longer looked simply pale and ill. His face was definitely different. Jacob's nose was thinner, longer. His mouth seemed smaller. His lips seemed to have taken on a half-hearted sneer. His face had taken on very familiar, frighteningly familiar characteristics. Jacob was beginning to resemble Freddy Krueger. He smiled pathetically, and with a dreaming look in his eyes began to sing.
Jacob, where did you learn that song?
My friend taught it to me.
What friend, Jacob? Who is he?
You know who he is, Alice.
Amanda!
And you know what he wants. He wants to make your child his own.
How do I stop him?
It may be too late. Your friend Yvonne thinks she can fight your battles for you.
Yvonne's fallen asleep?
Yes.
Jacob! Where did Jacob go? Jacob!
Jacob is losing the battle, and once he loses, there will be no stopping Freddy.
Amanda pointed down the corridor behind Alice, who spun around and gasped as she saw Jacob staggering around a corner and disappearing. Alice tore after him, racing around the corner. She found herself standing in a deserted corridor, determination burning in her eyes. She saw a wall ahead of her begin to pulse, change color, throb with veins, grow long vertical lips that opened into a glistening pink tunnel. Alice took a deep breath and ran for the opening, picking up speed as she neared the wall and finally plunged between the lips, landing firmly on her feet in Freddy's boiler. She turned around to see Freddy, but she couldn't see all of him. From the chest up, he was perfectly visible, but below that, there was nothing, as if he were poking his head out of thin air. Around him, the air wavered like the surface of a smooth pond being disturbed.
Welcome to Freddyland!
What are you doing to my son, Krueger? To my friend? Where's your bond?
Freddy's arm appeared suddenly from nowhere. His fist was closed tight on a clump of Yvonne's hair, lifting her head from the pool of thin air. Her face and hair were wet, and she shook her head gasping as if she had been held underwater. Then he shoved her back into nothingness.
What's the matter, Alice? Running out of friends again?
Her forehead creased as she concentrated on Krueger and on her anger, until the invisible vertical pool became a wall of flames that engulfed Freddy. Yvonne tumbled from the nothingness, falling to the floor in a steaming, seared heap.
I came looking for you this time, Krueger. This time is between you and me.
Why do you think I let her go?
Because it's not Yvonne that you need. You need my baby. With him, you can come into the real world and make yourself even stronger. Well, you're not coming back through Jacob, you son of a bitch.
His face twisted into a hideous mask of hatred. Freddy lunged for her. Alice dove aside, kicking up a leg to trip him. Her foot caught his ankle, and Freddy plunged forward, flipping over the edge of the boiler room walkway, but not before he reached out and grabbed her leg, pulling her over with him. Alice screamed as they fell, fighting to maintain her control.
Remember, you are your own dream master.
Alice concentrated hard on Greta, mentally clinging to the vivid image of her friend until they hit the filthy concrete floor below. Alice broke from a smooth roll to stand on her feet. She smiled triumphantly when she saw that Freddy was trapped in an enormous high chair made of filthy, rusted metal. He cried out, enraged, as he fought to free his arms from the metal tray that crossed his lap. He curled his arms under the tray and heaved, grunting with exertion, the muscle cords in his neck pressing tautly against his skin, until finally the tray began to give. Alice concentrated hard on Dan, drawing strength from his memory, power from his love, and she felt herself changing, transforming. She fell to her hands and knees, except they weren't hands and knees anymore. Her arms were above her head, stretched out on each side like handlebars, and her legs curled up tighter and tighter until they formed a perfectly round circle, a wheel, and another wheel grew from her chest, coming to rest on the concrete. As Freddy tore the tray away and stood up in the high chair, lifting the tray over his head to throw at Alice, she shot towards him in a streak of gleaming chrome, crashing through the high chair and sending Freddy into the air, flailing helplessly like a rag doll. Alice spun around and faced him when he landed, her engine growling like a wild beast. Freddy crouched, bracing himself for her as Alice shot forward again. At precisely the right moment, Freddy leaped into the air onto Alice as she sped by. Feeling him clutching her handlebars and straddling her back, Alice began to concentrate again, this time on the asylum, on Freddy's 100 lunatic fathers. She headed straight for a concrete wall with a burst of speed, hitting it and crashing through the concrete easily, landing with a jerk on the floor of the asylum. She fell into a roll and came out of it on her feet, herself once again. As Freddy stood and glanced around at his surroundings with a look of frightened recognition on his face, Alice found the stairs that led to the door above and climbed them slowly, watching, waiting. They oozed from the shadows, some of them wearing filthy hospital gowns, others only tatters or completely naked. Freddy spun around to flee, but they surrounded him, coming in from all sides, closing in more rapidly as Alice watched them from above. Some of them laughed, others growled, and some just made low gurgling sounds as they reached out. And Freddy looked up at Alice and screamed as they fell on him, pulling at him, ripping, clawing.
Welcome home, Freddy.
Alice turned, walked up the stairs, and stepped into the corridor, closing the heavy iron door behind her.
Mommy, want to meet my new friend?
Jacob, get away from him.
You've learned a few tricks from me, little Alice, but you haven't learned them all.
Let go of him, Kruger. You won't hurt him. You need us both.
I've got you both.
Come on, Jacob. We're going home.
This is your home, Jacob.
Jacob, I'm your mother.
But I'm your friend, and friends are more fun.
Jacob seemed torn, looking from Alice to Freddy and back again. She beckoned him with both hands and called his name again. He finally broke away from Freddy and ran toward her, arms outstretched. But his feet skittered to a halt, and Alice's voice caught in her throat when a man called out from behind.
Hey, Jacob, wait.
The boy stopped and turned. Alice looked over his shoulder. Dan was walking down the corridor toward Jacob, his smile warm and loving.
Let's go to your mother, Jacob.
Jacob, that's not Dan. It's Kruger. Let him go, Freddy. Come on, Jacob. I love you. Hurry!
Jacob threw himself towards Alice. Razor-sharp claws sprang from the man's fingers and swiped the air inches from Jacob's face. Jacob dove for his mother and slid between her arms, slamming into her torso. They were engulfed. In a sudden flash of soft, glowing light, as Jacob merged silently with his mother, Alice felt him pass into her body, and she sucked in a deep breath, opening her eyes and screaming as Freddy leaped toward her, plunging through the aura of white light and passing into her like a knife directly behind Jacob. Alice fell to the floor. Retching, she cried out at the top of her lungs. Alice turned to see Amanda Kruger standing before a large door, the iron door that led to the room full of maniacs.
You brought Freddy Krueger into this world, Amanda. Now it's time to take him back.
He's an abomination.
You've got to take him back. You're caught in the circle with him, and the only way to break it is to take him back.
Alice swayed with another pain, but this one did not stop. With her hands on her belly, she felt movement inside. Powerful, restless movement. She looked down to see her belly growing rapidly, expanding like a balloon being inflated. And all the while, there was movement within. She staggered back against the wall and cried. Amanda stared at Alice's growing belly for a long moment, then stepped forward with a resigned nod. A spasm of pain knocked Alice to her knees. She looked up at Amanda pleadingly. Amanda leaned forward, placed a gentle hand on Alice's stomach and said,
My son, I forgive you.
Alice convulsed as something tore away inside her, and a burst of dull light, the color of sickness and death, oozed from her abdomen, flashed and shot directly into Amanda's, making Amanda stumble backward. Alice stood slowly. There was a long, silent pause between them, until Amanda fell to her knees and clutched her face as her skin began to shift, to bubble like melted wax, and the skin on her hands began to shrivel and darken. Alice rushed toward her to help, but Amanda cried,
No, get away from me. Take your son and leave. Save your son.
She paused, grimacing as Amanda's condition became worse. Her nose narrowed and lengthened. Her eyes became sinister, glistening slits. Amanda began to resemble her own monstrous son. Alice turned and dashed down the corridor, stopping a few hundred yards away. She turned to look at Amanda, but doors were slamming all the way down the corridor, closing the passage off, separating her from the nun. She turned again and ran on down the corridor.
Come on, Jacob. We're going home.